What's up everybody, Dan here. Thanks so much for joining in for today's video. So today I'm going to be giving you my review of the Thrustmaster T248 wheelbase that comes as a bundle. Included is the steering wheel and a set of pedals. But before we get any further in this review, I'm going to give you my customary disclaimer that Thrustmaster did send me this wheelbase. However, they didn't pay me any money. They had no input on what I say here, and all views and opinions that you will hear in this video are my own. And lastly, they will not see this video before you do. Next thing I'm going to touch on real quick is how I do my reviews. If you've been here before, you'll know this, but for anybody who may be finding me just now for the first time, I try to keep my reviews as simple and as quick and to the point as possible. So what I do is I give you a brief overview of the product, and then I will go into each individual component of the product by giving you some pros and cons, and then at the end I will follow it up with my final thoughts and let you know if I think it is a good value for the price. All right, so let's jump into the overview here. So, in my opinion, as far as Thrustmaster's lineup goes, this falls somewhere between the entry to mid-range category. There are certainly Thrustmaster wheels that fall below this, and of course there are many wheelbases that fall above this, so that's why I think that it falls somewhere between entry and mid-range. The MSRP of this wheel typically is $399 US. However, for the last little while, and the reason why I wanted to review this is that it has been hovering around $300. So there's a significant price reduction here. My opinion is that this will be somewhat permanent because Thrustmaster is probably aware of the price discrepancy at $399, as with the current market of sim racing equipment in general, $399 is probably going to be too high for this. And again, I'll get more into that later, but I'm generally doing this review with the price of around $300 in mind. So just keep that in your mind while we're going through these items. This wheelbase has the industry standard of 900 degrees of rotation. This wheelbase has approximately 3.5 Newton meters of torque. That's not specifically stated by Thrustmaster, but I've seen that reported quite a few times. And based upon other wheelbases that I've used that I know how powerful they were supposed to be, I feel like 3.5 Newton meters here is probably pretty close to accurate. Internally, it uses a hybrid mechanical system that provides the force feedback that you're feeling through your hands. And all that means is that it uses a combination of belts and gears. So real quick, typically cheaper force feedback wheels in this category either use a belt system or a gear system, and Thrustmaster has kind of combined them here for the T248 to try to get the best of both worlds. Everything that you're going to find here in this package is completely made of plastic. There's not really any high-end materials here. There are two versions of this. Both are compatible with PC, but one is compatible with Xbox, the other is compatible with PlayStation. So you're going to want to make sure that you pick the correct one that goes with the console of your choice, and it's pretty easy to tell. Just look at the buttons on the front. If you want the Xbox one, it will have the same exact buttons that come on the Xbox controller, whereas the PlayStation version on the steering wheel has PlayStation buttons. So just make sure you pick the right one. And then lastly, in the box, both versions will come with a set of T3 PM pedals. All right, so let's hop right over to the wheelbase's pros and cons here. So, first pro for the wheelbase is it is actually more powerful than other similarly priced wheelbases on the market. And with that said, keep in mind I'm talking about this at a $300 price point, not the $400 price point. But at $300, it is definitely significantly more power than other similarly priced wheelbases. Next pro here is that the force feedback is surprisingly detailed. A lot of times with these cheaper wheels, the low-end detail is kind of missing, and to get it out you actually have to crank the wheelbase up so high that you'll start to clip at the top. But this actually has a decent amount of range, which I was quite surprised with. The next pro here is that it has 3 force feedback modes. Mode number 1 is basically a default. It's going to provide you 100% proportional to what the game is sending out. Mode number 2, they call that enhanced mode, and they say it's best for skid control. And then number 3, which I think a lot of people will use, is called boosted mode, and what that does is it amplifies small effects like curb surface details, stuff like that. Next pro here for the wheelbase is it has a very good build quality for the price point. Everything here is made of plastic, but it feels pretty solid. It's got some good weight to it, and I don't see any issues with long-term reliability here. All right, next pro is it can be hard mounted or it can be mounted using the included desk clamp. And the last pro here for the wheelbase is that most recent games here are going to recognize it right away and automatically load a profile. And if you are a first-time sim racer, that is huge because it can get confusing for some wheelbases and pedal sets to try to figure figure out how to map everything. But this one, generally, when you plug it in, it's going to automatically recognize the wheelbase, and it's going to automatically load a profile set of buttons and stuff like that. So you literally could just plug this thing up, hop out on track, and get to racing. All right, so let's slide over here to the cons. And I would say the biggest con of the wheelbase here is that the steering wheel is not removable. So what you see is what you get. That is really a shame, because Thrustmaster has a lot of really cool steering wheels in their ecosystem. Unfortunately, you are not going to be able to utilize and use those because the steering wheel is not removable. All right, so the next con here is that if you turn the force feedback up really high, some of the artificial effects can get pretty noisy. So like running over curbs, if you do any off-road racing where the surface has a lot of fine detail, if you've got the force feedback up really high, you're going to hear this. This can be pretty loud. Now, it is not loud to the extent of like a Logitech G29 wheelbase. Those are extremely obnoxious, but just know that you are going to hear this, which could be a little annoying if there's people around you or if you have shared walls, stuff like that. So just keep that in mind. And then the last con here kind of falls on a similar subject, and that is when you're changing directions, you can start to feel the notchiness in the gear system inside this wheelbase. Now, they've done a pretty good job of minimizing this by utilizing also belts, which typically can dampen that notchiness of a gear. But at the end of the day, the gear is still in there, and you can feel it, especially when you're like catching a slide or something like that, and you've got these really rapid changes in direction of the wheelbase. You can certainly start to feel the notchiness there, but it's not the end of the world, and I think it's perfectly acceptable for this price point. So now we're going to hop over to the steering wheel here, and we're going to get on the pros. So by far the biggest pro of this steering wheel has got to be the magnetic shifters. Typically, wheelbases at this price point, or steering wheels that come with wheelbases at this price point, the shifters feel terrible. But these are magnetic shifters, and they actually feel very good. They are very snappy, they're very responsive, and they have a very tactile feel to them, which is really good at this price point. Next pro is that it has plenty of buttons, and they are also going to be specific to the console of your choice. So like I said earlier in the review, you will recognize these buttons depending on what console you normally use. And if you're using this on console, they will automatically out of the box do the exact same thing that the standard controller buttons would do on that console. All right, so the next pro for the steering wheel is the digital display. You typically do not find something like this on a wheel of this price point. Sometimes you will see just a tack light, but certainly not a physical display where you can change settings and things like that. You typically will have to spend quite a bit more money to get something like this. This display can be used to change a lot of settings, and it can also display telemetry data depending on what game you're playing. So as far as the settings you can go through, you can change things like your force feedback modes, you can change the overall strength, you can adjust your degrees of rotation, and a bunch of other stuff like that. You can do all this stuff on the fly while you're in game. And then as far as things you can display while you're racing, they have various different versions of sweeping tack lights. You can display your speed, your RPM, best lap times, and quite a few other things like that. Next pro is that it actually has some pretty decent feeling 10 and 2 notches. And then the last pro here is that it gets the job done. It's not going to be the best thing in the world, but it will certainly do the trick, and you can certainly race and drive with it. All right, so now we're going to hop over to the cons of the steering wheel here. And unfortunately, this steering wheel, out of the 3 main items that come with this bundle, it is the weakest link. I mean, it's not terrible quality, but it's certainly the quality of the steering wheel and the build and stuff is not up to par with the wheelbase and the pedals here. So it is certainly the weakest link. And so the first con here, and this is a big one, is it overall just feels pretty cheap and toy-like. So the wheelbase and the pedals, which I'll talk about more later, they pack a punch above the price point. But the steering wheel actually lacks in this aspect. So it is packing below the price point. And yeah, it just feels and definitely looks like a toy, unfortunately. The next con here is that the outer half of the rim is a different material than the inner half, which this really contributes to the first con. It's just an odd sensation for the outer half to have this fake leather, pleather kind of stuff. And then the inner half is just a hard plastic. And the contrast when you're holding onto it is just weird. And you know, maybe if other people have had a different opinion on this, certainly chime in the comments below. But for me anyways, having this soft leather on the outside of the rim and then the hard plastic on the inside is just off-putting. I do not like it. So I'm always wearing gloves just so I don't have to feel that stuff. And it's just a weird design decision. Personally, I would have rather they just go with the rubberized material that is found on a lot of steering wheels at this price point. Because yes, it still looks cheap, but at least it's a lot more natural and feels better when you're holding it. All right, right, so the next con is again about this material on the outside edge. So it has very little texture. It's almost non-existent. So it's very slippery. So if you're going to do some high intense racing, especially if you're in a room that has a high temperature, you know, sim racing, we get pretty hot. And if you're like me, where your palms get sweaty, you will certainly need gloves. Handheld is not going to be an option here if your hands get wet at all from sweat, because you're just not going to be able to hold on to the steering wheel and make the adjustments that you need to make while you're racing. The next con here is actually dealing with the paddles. And while these paddles are fantastic in feel, they are very loud. And if you have anyone around you about the 4th or 5th time you upshift, they're going to be yelling at you, because these are some of the loudest paddles I have ever used. Next con is about the buttons on the face of the wheel. They really don't have any tactile feel. The best word I can use to describe them is that they're really squishy. All right, and the next con, which is really not a huge deal either way, but it is a con, is the red race strip in the middle of the steering wheel, that center stripe. It just looks like an afterthought. It literally looks like somebody just wrapped some tape around it. And personally, I think that I would have preferred it just not be there at all, because it really looks like I bought this bundle without a stripe, and then I took a piece of tape and literally just wrapped it around the top. And if I did it, it wouldn't be professional looking. So hopefully you catch my drift there. And the last con here, and I think this is a pretty big one, at least for me, is that it's pretty small. It's only 280 millimeters in diameter, and it's also a flat bottom, so it's not going to be ideal for all racing genres. And the problem with that is that you can't remove it from the wheelbase. So if it is a steering wheel that you're going to have to use forever and always, I think it would have been much more versatile and work with more genres of racing if it was just a little larger and completely round. For example, flat bottom is really not great for drifting. So if you're going to be drifting with this wheelbase, it may not be ideal. And then something like rally really requires a little bit larger of a wheelbase than this offers. So again, it is a con. This is definitely going to fall on personal preference, but at least for me, I think that it really should have been slightly larger and definitely completely round so that it was much more versatile, since we can't remove it off the wheelbase. All right, and now we're going to move over to the T3PM pedals. And in the bundle, this is by far the best item in my opinion. So let's hop into some pros here. So the biggest pro is that the brake pedal here, this is one of the best non-load cell brakes that I have ever used. I do not know what kind of voodoo Thrustmaster is doing with this brake pedal, but for a non-load cell brake pedal, this thing feels fantastic. It is not going to live up to the standards of a load cell. That is not what I'm trying to say, so just keep that in mind. But for a non-load cell brake, this is one of the best. The next pro here is also about the brake pedal, and that is you can adjust the feel and stiffness using the included springs and elastomers. The next pro here is that all 3 pedals use magnetic sensors with 10 bits of resolution. So that means they're going to be quite precise, and they're also going to last a long time. Next pro on the list here is that outside of a load cell brake, these are nearly identical to the TLCM pedals. The TLCM pedals are Thrustmaster's flagship pedals at this time. I have reviewed them in the past, and they are really good. So the fact that these much cheaper pedals are very similar is definitely a pro here. And then the last pro, we'll wrap it up with the fact that these can be hard mounted with bolts. A lot of times when you buy into these entry/mid budget range bundles from any manufacturer, not just Thrustmaster, the pedals are not set up to be hard mounted, which means you'll always have this issue where if they're very stiff, they're going to slide away from you when you step on them. But fortunately here, they're very secure and there's no movement at all. Okay, so I'm actually going to move over to a neutral category here. I've got a couple of things to talk about that are not good, not bad. They just are things that I wanted to mention. And so the first neutral point here is that the clutch and throttle pedal are about average for the price point. They're not worse than others at a similar price point, but they're not better either. They are just about the same. The next neutral point here is that visually they appear to be less quality than they actually are. So this was something that really surprised me, because when I first opened the box and I saw these, they didn't look very good. But once I pulled them out of the box and realized how hefty they were, I realized pretty quickly that there was more going on. And then when I mounted them up and started using them in game, that's when I realized that they are actually much, much better than they appear. Now we're going to move over to the cons here. And honestly, there is only one, and it's not going to be a con for everybody, but I did want to put it in the con category. And that is simply that the brake pedal is not a load cell. And the reason why I call that a con is because out of all of the things that you can spend money on in sim racing, there is certainly truth to the fact that with a load cell, it is easier to be more consistent, which will lead to better lap times in time. Now, that's not to say that you can't be quick with this non-load cell brake pedal in this package, because you absolutely can, but load cells do offer an advantage where no other piece of sim racing equipment, no matter how much you spend, is going to give you an advantage over its cheaper counterpart other than a load cell brake pedal. So this is a con here, that it doesn't have a load cell brake pedal included, but this is still a fantastic set of pedals, and the brake pedal here is very, very good for the price point. All right, now we're going to move over to my final thoughts here, and I'm going to let you know if I think that this is a good value for the price. And I can sum this up with one phrase. Yes, this is a good value, but it's for a specific user, and it's only at a specific price. In this market, at this current time, I do not think this is worth the MSRP of $399. There's just not enough value for that price, especially with this non-removable steering wheel. And also consider the fact that there are quite a few options that are $399 that are much better as a whole package, some of them being direct drive wheels. But at $300, which is what it has been priced at recently, it is a much better value proposition, and in my mind, it is well worth that. So at $300, this is a great option for a first-time wheel user that's looking to get away from using a controller and actually dip their toes into the hobby with a quality force feedback racing wheel. If you were going to spend $400, I would personally recommend you something else. But at $300, I think this is a great starting point. Now, who I would not recommend this to is someone who already has a beginner wheel and is now considering an upgrade. So if you've already got a T248 or a Logitech G923, this wheelbase is better than those for sure, but it's not enough of a step up to warrant paying another $300 if you already have a beginner wheel. If you're someone in this bracket of people and you've already got one of these and you're looking for an upgrade, what I would recommend is that you actually spend just a little bit more money and go ahead and step up to something like a CSL-DD or the Moza equivalent, or something that will be much better than this package for not that much more money. So I hope that all makes sense. So for the right people in the right scenario at $300, this is certainly a good value, and for those people, I highly recommend it. For everyone else, I probably would not. All right, so that's going to sum up my review of the Thrustmaster T248. If you found this review helpful, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing. It really helps me out with the YouTube algorithm. And as always, guys, I truly appreciate you tuning in and watching my videos. That's going to be it here, and I will talk to you guys in the next one.